Today I'm talking with Dave Jamieson of the Jamieson Consulting Group. Dave is the first of a series of tapping wisdom interviews that I will be conducting as part of Inclined Leadership Strategies. Dave and I have been friends for over 30 years, starting out as more of a sage and a mentor and professor for me. And over the years, it looks like I've caught up in some ways, and we've become really good colleagues.
Of course, good colleagues, absolutely, absolutely.
So I want to just spend some time tapping Dave's wisdom that he can share with us about where we are today, how we can take some of his thoughts, insights, and advice to to thrive even more thoughtfully and productively in these pretty volatile times. So I'm going to turn it over to Dave to introduce himself, and we'll proceed for about 20 minutes.
Great. Well, thank you, Sue. Yeah, I look forward to having this conversation with you. And well, my background is about 50 years in the professional field of organization development and change. But most of my life was on the practice side. And the last 10 years, I served as a tenured professor in some programs. And so the main thing I highlight is I have been a true scholar practitioner, and I believe in it deeply, meaning that you learn enough about theory and research and things to improve practice. And at the same time, practice has an equal stance with research and theory, so that there's a lot we learn from practice. And I've believed that all my career, and now as I've taught other people through educational programs, I try to convey the same thing. So when I'm thinking today too about where we are and what we need to pay attention to, I think about it the same way. I mean, I will talk mostly from the standpoint of where do we need to spend our attention as leaders, and how does leadership need to change? And a lot of that involves organizations, how they need to change, how we need to create them differently, and those kinds of different things. So I think that it's very timely and very important. And for me, like I said, my career has 40 years of consulting and 10 years in academia, basically.
So that's a great intro. So Dave, tell us in these VUCA times, right? So volatile, uncertain, chaotic, complex, and ambiguous times. Everyone is struggling in some ways, in similar ways, and in some ways very different ways.
Yeah.
What I like to say about leadership, leadership is not for the faint of heart. And these are particularly difficult times for leaders themselves, and then leading their teams and leading their organizations.
Yes.
So what from your practice and your insights can you share that can help people maybe think about things a little bit differently?
Yeah. One thing that comes to my mind is our history in management has been built heavily on control orientations. That is, we tend to build systems that are trying to control a lot of things at the same time. And what I've been learning a lot about is that it's time to move a little bit away from control, but to what? And the to what, in my mind, is we need to think more about engaged commitment with people. And the kind of things we do when we're control oriented, we do not create engaged commitment from people. The best we create sometimes is compliance with people. And a pandemic and a VUCA world, for some leaders, will push them even more into whatever they already know and not explore new possibilities. And that worries me. So I think we need to pay more attention, both from a coaching point of view and a leadership development point of view, and just a friend point of view to leaders, that there are ways to help leaders think about their role differently. So we're moving from control to engaged commitment. We also need to help leaders think in shorter time cycles, because complexity teaches us that there are way more unknowns than we can manage, and we don't know exactly what each action's going to do. And yet we've grown up and we've taught people saying, you do A, you get B, you do C, you get D. That isn't true anymore. And so one way we can learn to operate differently is not only getting that engaged commitment, which means you're pulling people together, you're pulling perspectives together, and you're supporting collaborative interactions. Now you're doing that in a way that also is happening in shorter cycles, meaning we need to look at where we are today. We need to get whatever data we have, and we'll never have enough anymore. And then we need to take action. We need to experiment more. We need shorter cycle things to try. And I know that's hard for people who want right answers. But there aren't as many right answers anymore, you know? And so what it means is I learn more if I take some action. So I need to take actions and learn from them. We call them experiments or trials or something. And we need to do it quickly so that we can capture what happens when you put an action in a system and the system produces a response. The response we call emergence, so we don't know exactly what's going to happen with it. And it has happened for 100 years in policies. We create a policy, and then 6 months later, we're fighting the resistance from it and everything else. And what I'm saying is we can't wait that long. We need short cycles of testing things, and then we learn from how that system interacts. And ironically, not every system is the same. So leaders have to learn what are the variables that interact in their own system, and it'll vary. Yeah.
Yeah. So let's talk then about that experimentation. Some of what you're talking about reminds me of Chris Christensen's work in The Innovators of DNA, right?
Yeah. And
So,
in design thinking, they have rapid prototyping. Same idea.
same idea from IDEO, yes.
Yep.
So, but here's the frame that concerns me about this, because this makes a lot of sense logically, is I worry about the politics of it. So not so much if you're in senior leadership, but if you're in middle or line leadership, and you want to take those cycles, and either the people over you aren't thinking that way, or the people over you, they're getting their pressures from either the board, if they're a public company, or Wall Street to deliver on a quarterly basis, and there isn't a lot of appetite for that. So the blame kind of gets kicked down to the people with the least amount of power to, to come back and resist. So how can we empower, people who may not be at, in the C-suite level, who that's easy, right? They can make the case to their board or to Wall Street, but because they have the power and the influence and the data and the resources, what do we say to people who are in the middle, right? Who are trying to assure their teams that it's okay to do that too. So how do they influence up, and how do they influence their teams?
And in part, one of the variables that always stands out in that is whether or not people in the middle actually have any empowerment at all. So when they don't, they risk a lot to take action. That's different. But here's the thing. The whole system involves those layers and involves all those different people. And you can't have the senior people operating one way and hoping that the middle people will operate a different way. Again, because the people with the most influence on the culture are still the senior people, but the people in the middle have learned the culture. And the question is, that culture is going to guide a lot of their behavioral choices. And my experience, what I've seen more than anything else, is I've seen the leaders tend to create limits and boundaries for what anybody else can do, rather than invite people in and ask for their best thinking. That's not been happening universally. And so one of the things that does, I think it stymies a lot of middle level leaders, and the same thing carries down one more level sometimes. And so I think in the way you're describing it, what I think about is, if we want people to start acting differently, at least somebody fairly high up has to get it. Doesn't have to be everybody, but it's got to be somebody. And we used to call them sponsors, or we used to call them protectors, so you could actually do change work. And I mean, I hate to think of it that way, but in some ways we have to make some agreements that says, maybe if a senior leader meets with their middle managers and they all start to collaborate together, maybe that is when the mindset would change. And there's a lot of work to help people do that if they have been living with a different approach in the past. And so we have to kind of open that up a little bit.
I think that makes so much sense. And I'm wondering if the hook is not just the case for the experiment, and the courage that it takes to take that risk, but also perhaps engaging that senior person as a mentor, right? And it's rather than as a sponsor, which, you know, has the risk of perhaps having accountability.
Yeah.
Right. And the blame and shame go up there. Right.
Right.
You know, it could be positioned as mentorship.
Yeah, that's true.
Right?
That's a good one. Well, and the other thing that we have to look at is, because again, when you look at whole systems, you look at what variables are affecting other variables. And here's a very interesting one. The metrics that everybody cares about are not going to operate well in a fast changing, complex world. They work very well in a relatively stable environment. And so if we're going to still focus on X number quarterly, then that's going to make people hesitant to try things out, which is probably the only way they'll learn what's really going to work. If 7 big top leaders sit in a room and decide, here's what we're going to do, and it's a 2-year program, it is probably not going to end up being successful that way, because they're doing it as what's the right thing to do. And we can't tell that in the really complex systems anymore. And I think that's a shame, because when I started in the field, it was a relatively stable world. You could diagnose against models and stuff like that, and you could usually find important changes to make. Now I'm not sure that I would use that as the starting point anymore. But we got to understand the problem. We got to get different points of view involved in it, and empower people to take some actions, but they're short cycles. So if you're going to fail, you're going to fail real quick, and you're going to learn and move on something else. So
it sounds like what you're saying is, you know, use the metrics to keep the core elements of the business that you're trying to just, you know, keep the wheels on the truck, as they say.
Yeah,
right?
yeah,
But while you're trying to do new and different things,
right?
Don't apply those kinds of metrics on them, because it's not a fair fight.
That's right. It's not. No, it's not.
This is new.
Well, and the other thing is, many of those metrics are an outcome measure. That is, they are the result of dozens of interacting things that occur inside the organization system, and then we get a result. We get a profit number, we get a engagement score, we get a whatever we're actually trying to measure. The problem is there's a dozen different things that went into that. And sometimes people think it's only 1 or 2. and that's why they keep focusing on those 1 or 2. So, you know, it's like, and I just think it's really a lot of rethinking and reframing is really where we are. We don't need a lot of new knowledge, because there's been decades of research that would help people think about how different actions will create different results. So, yeah.
So, we've got people who are at different levels of leadership. And we also have people who are at different stages of their careers.
Yeah.
Many of the people who are in senior leadership, I'm going to make a broad statement.
Yeah.
Major organizations have been
Yeah.
through substantial amounts of leadership development. But
Yeah.
there is a whole generation, millennials, even some,
Yep.
younger Gen Xers,
Yes. Yes.
really, they that got pulled for many years.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
While that started coming back over the last number of years, there's quite a lot of catch up, and that's why I think your point about control. I mean, we've known not to be controlling, since the
Yeah.
70s.
But that hasn't
We're
stopped much
learning
of it.
that lesson today,
That's right. That's
right?
right.
Because there's a whole generation of people who are just defaulting to exactly what you said, to what they know.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, what are, just some like the top 3 things that we can say to them to kind of help them think about, letting go of control and remaining accountable to the
Hmm.
business, so that,
Hmm.
there's a safety net, right there. I know Brene Brown says, have courage, no blame, no shame, but at the end of the
Right.
day, we are also accountable.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Well, and so part of it starts with when we're setting goals. Um, does the person getting those goals have them laid on them, or are they having a conversation and a dialogue? Because the other thing you have to think about is what's realistic. If I'm closer to the workforce that's going to do the work than you are, we have to negotiate the right kind of goals. And it's, of course, it's driven always by some other big financial number. I get that. The reality is they may not be realistic in the way they want it done. And so to me, I think we have to start by having younger leaders or people younger in leadership positions to begin having some comfort in putting their knowledge to work with the other leaders, and then come up with a plan that seems to make sense to both of them, and it has a good target and all that kind of stuff. Because then the next step is, how do I now show up and approach others who work in my team? Because that's where we alienate people too often, or we disempower them when we act certain ways, or we don't invite their point of view into the conversation. And those are simple collaborative behaviors is what they are. And the leader can show some trust in people when they invite people in. And I think in today's world, I don't think any of us are going to singularly do a good job of making all the decisions. So, and even when I've been a leader, I know the draw to do some controlling things, because you're trying to accelerate something or get it done fast, or not spend time talking to people, just telling them what to do. And I know that almost never worked in any of my leadership roles. So we need to get that through. And if people look at their leadership as a behavior and not just as what's on the spreadsheet at the end of the year. And I think we equate leadership with those financial results more than we do the behavior they do.
Yeah. So goal setting, collaborative goal setting with our management, and then engaging with our teams,
Mm-hmm,
right,
mm-hmm,
to
mm-hmm.
talk about the realities of what this means, in taking action, implementation, execution.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes.
And
Well, and leadership development itself needs some changes as well, because what we have spent most of our time on in leadership development was really what I call the technical aspects of leadership. That is what we do. We keep telling people about how the systems here work and what we expect of our leaders to carry this out and get X results. That is called leadership development. But it never has anything to do with who the person is and what they need to develop in order to execute as a decent leader. And then what is a decent leader? Well, that's the model that the culture says is decent. And it may or may not be true. It may have been very true 30 years ago, and it may need to be different now. And I haven't seen us integrating enough through leadership development that would start to balance the technical and the person side of leadership. So that's the other area that I think we need to do more of, in terms of helping people understand I mean, build their self-awareness so they understand who they are and what they're really good at and what they have difficulty with so they can work on the difficulties. And no leader likes to say, oh yeah, I don't like it when I have a difficult conversation with one of my people. Well, but it's going to be part of your job every week. So yes, you need to learn something about that. And yeah, and we've all had leaders. We've all worked for people who were very harsh when they talked to us, and other people who were very clear and critical, but in a way that was very helpful and developmental. Those are behaviors. People can learn those things. And I think that's another piece that needs to be dealt with. So
couldn't agree with you more. I think the biggest thing cross-culturally, cross-generationally, that everyone can agree on is when we're having those conversations, we want those conversations to be fair and respectful. There's almost nothing that we can talk about and get through as long as both sides are being fair.
That's right.
And respectful with each other. There's a lot you can get through with that is being foundational. And that to me kind of underlies what you're saying about that human element. That's the human element, good sauce right there.
Right. Well, and I mean, and so we've always had this balance between the human and the technical side. And I don't think half the people have ever learned to think of it as a balance. Some people go hog wild on the human side. Some people go hog wild on the technical side. Neither one is going to get us there. But integrated and balanced is probably the right solution. And so when you're a leader, you also have to be thinking that way about your system, because there's always going to be the human side and there's always going to be the technical side. And you can't go and say one side's hard and one side's soft, and then everybody ignores that. That's just creating the wrong climate. It's creating the wrong set of variables that people are going to look at.
It's a false choice.
It is. Exactly.
So it sounds like your resolution of that is kind of your two-prong rather than even really three-prong approach, your two-prong approach, which is kind of collaborative, goal setting, shorter term between, vertically through the organization, and keeping it short term, and then horizontal, right? Working with our teams.
Yes.
To engage in that, to get feedback on it, and to really get their hands all over it to ensure qualities of it are being implemented.
And and we've learned this from 50 years ago, maybe, that if you give empowerment to a team of people that is mixed with the right perspectives, they'll solve almost any problem, and they'll do it better than the leader could do by themselves. Yeah. We've known that for years, but a lot of leaders have trouble just letting go of it because it might have big financial implications. And so we need to kind of balance that out a little bit. And it's fascinating to be at an organization or a company where the people are in fact engaged and committed, and you see the difference. And you can be in one of your meetings, you can ask, who wants to take care of this? 3 people volunteer, they go and run with it. That's a lot better than me having to manage everybody's work day to day, right? And so we know these principles, but I would say they're not universally practiced yet.
Yes.
And so, so that's where we get stuck. And then our environment is so different now that we have to pay attention to even all of the things we learned so far about change and how we went about changing. And I think all of our principles are right. I think we've learned a lot about when people actually change their behavior, because change isn't setting up new policies and new structures. Change is when behavior changes. And so what's interesting is we don't pay attention sometimes to what we already know about behavior change. And now the world is so different that I think what we have to do is not give up the principles of that, but we do have to do things faster than we ever did before. I think we do have to rethink about how many people we get involved so that we are not only getting the right inputs, because we don't have time to do a year's worth of data collection, but we do have time to put the right people in the same room and they bring the data with them. So we
Absolutely.
accelerate things that way. And those are just a couple of examples, but I've talked a lot now about how we change needs to change. And it's not give up the principles, but learn how to do them in different ways. And I think that's the other thing that I think every leader's stuck with, because nobody's managing a stable organization anymore. They're all managing one stuck in continuous change.
Right.
So
Yeah.
so we need to support and help them, I
Yeah, we
think.
have different scenarios, right? We have workplaces that are all remote. We
Yep.
have others that are hybrid, and then we have
Hybrid.
others that are essential, where people are all, nothing has changed in terms
Change, not,
of a
yeah,
truck driver needing to get in a truck and haul, you
that's
know,
right.
a
That's
soda
right.
from point A to point B, right? That's
Right.
not changed.
And
The
most of the healthcare people
well,
are,
I
yeah,
mean, there's, the police officer. I mean, there's millions of people who are
absolutely.
out there. So,
That's right. That's right.
so
They're doing the same thing with masks.
with
That's
masks,
all. They're doing the same thing they always did with
and
masks.
and putting their lives at
At
risk.
risk, at risk, right. That's
So,
right.
what's great about the kind of the vertical, right, alignment with
Mm-hmm.
kind of the horizontal reality check and engagement is it applies regardless of the nature of your workplace,
That's right. That's
right?
exactly right. That's
It's
exactly right.
the totality out of it. People have a lot of nervousness and
Mm-hmm.
about
Mm-hmm.
kind of taking that step into it. So
Yeah.
we're talking to that 33-year-old first time, manager,
Yeah.
right,
Yeah.
who has a
Yeah.
team and it's all remote. uh, we
Mm-hmm.
can say to them, hey, you have some ideas, you can take that and go with your data, as you said,
Mm-hmm.
with your
Mm-hmm.
information and with your, kind of incremental goal setting,
Yep.
you can go up
Yep.
and try to engage a sponsor or a mentor,
Yep. Yep.
right,
Yep. Yep.
to see
Good.
if you
That's
can
good.
try new things.
That's great. No, that's perfect. And I know so many people feel some semi-helpless, either because of the culture that they're now used to, or because of this awful turmoil and disruption that they're facing. So they become silent and voiceless and a bit intimidated. And what we need to do is open up those resources. These are important, decently paid resources that we brought into our organization, but we're still only using probably 10, 15, 20% of our best resources, because other people are a little stymied, and we can change that. The leaders can change that.
Yeah, there is a lot of fear out there. I mean, there's a
Yes.
fear of job security and just
Yep.
physical safety. And often those line managers they're not they may be coming up with their own ideas, but often it's their line employees that are coming to them
That's right.
with
That's
ideas
right.
about boots on the ground. So now we're
That's
talking
right.
to people, in senior management, what does it take for them who have their own pressures,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
right? And they're not really thinking as much about what's happening boots on the ground.
That's right.
That has its own set of challenges to be able to, think, strategically,
Yep.
as
Yep. Yep.
well as tactically. you
Exactly.
know,
Exactly.
that's also very challenging. So,
Yep. Yep.
maybe we
Yep.
can kind of conclude by passing on some words of wisdom to that group, because at the end of the day, that's where the decisions happen.
Yeah. Yeah. Um, I mean, what struck me in what you were just saying was what the words I thought about was the intelligence of the frontline worker, because that's what doesn't get tapped very often. And 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 I was thinking about the best socio-technical redesign work that was ever done was always done by design teams that came from the floor, because they knew more about work and they knew all the ways to get around the problems and everything else. And if you're a really good senior leader, hopefully you're still in touch with that, but a lot of them are so busy they're not in touch with that anymore. And so what they need to do is they need to to support it. They need to start it. They need to help it and launch it, but they don't have the exact knowledge that's needed to change it. And so one of the things I've learned from 50 years of trying to change anything is every time we try to do any change to other people, they rarely work. But when we ask people to develop their change and co-create it, it tends to work a lot better. And the problem is in bigger organizations, you still need 3 levels of approval before you can do anything. But you can get a better answer when we engage people to make the change. So
that's right. That's right. And so the other word that I like to use is patience, right?
mm-hmm,
Because when
mm-hmm.
we're thinking strategically, and so much, the life or demise of an organization could rest with decisions that are made at the top. Some of the things that are happening tactically at the ground level can seem less important.
I
And
know.
right, so we've all been there if we've been
Yeah,
in the senior management role,
yeah,
and at the same time, it could be those as Malcolm Gladwell talked about tipping points, right? Those
yeah,
incremental changes could
yep,
make some sort of tipping point, right? Like the classic Post-it note
yes, yeah,
story from 3M, right?
yeah,
Was
exactly, exactly.
3M. So we never know what the next Post-it note
That's
idea
right.
is
That's
going to be coming from the ground up.
That's exactly right. And so you have to create a little space where that can happen. You have to open it up. You have to encourage it. And for all those younger people who find themselves in this position of not being sure of what to say or what to do, um, the other thing that's important, I think, is for them to um, open up the conversation. If the higher level leader isn't, at least they can open up the conversation. And the other way to do that is to ask a lot of questions first. Don't walk in and act like you already know it all, but understand what questions to ask and then suggest and make a case for something. So I think that's another thing that people can do. Yeah. So
Absolutely,
yeah.
absolutely. So just to kind of sum up, uh,
Okay.
I think we talked about a lot of things. What would you say are the biggest takeaways that people can bring from watching this discussion?
Oh well, there's a few probably. One of them to me is is how many people are in very responsible positions without a good understanding of systems. And so whatever they're making their decisions on, I would just say it's limited. And so they're missing data and they're missing points of view. They may personally not really care about it. The problem is the system will still win. And so it's important to understand that. So that's one piece. Another piece is this business about our leaders are operating and developed mostly through the technical side of leadership and not enough through the personal side. And I think if you start younger, it's even easier because you're not unlearning too many things. You're beginning to develop yourself and you're beginning to see what actually works, how the leader impacts people they deal with, because we can't ignore those impacts. And doesn't mean that everybody will love everything you do. It's that they'll love the majority of what you do. And that seems to make a stronger leader. So, and then the change piece is something that's going to be on all of our backs for a long time. And I just think that we ought to ask more people about their experience with why did change not work and what do we now in 2020 or 2030 need to be thinking about that'll help the change occur better.
Yeah.
I think that's really critical. So,
Thank you,
yep.
Dave. This has been
Thank you.
a really robust conversation. For those
Mhm.
of you who are interested in contacting Dave Jamieson, he is on LinkedIn, and you can also find him at Dave Jamieson Consulting.
Mhm.
And thank you very much, and have
Thank you.
a good day.
Thank you all. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.